Yo, what's going on, YouTube, and welcome back to Goal Line Hockey. It's your boy, Kevin Forte. We are continuing the season preview series today as we take a look at the Toronto Maple Leafs. Do the Leafs finally have what it takes to bring a Stanley Cup back to Toronto? We're going to be going over that right now. So, the Toronto Maple Leafs. You look at their top point producers last season. Mitch Marner led the way with 67 points. Austin Matthews, John Tavares, William Nylander. The big guys, the big four. That's really what it was for the Lightning. Morgan Rielly, Zach Hyman, Jason Spezza, Jake Muzzin, Kerfoot, Thornton, Hall, Mikheyev, Brody. You go down the list. That's pretty much your top point producers. And it's pretty much top heavy. It's those top four and everybody else kind of behind them. And you could argue Morgan Rielly, I'll give him some credit. But this is going to be a different team in terms of some of the guys they had to replace. Because you look at some of the guys they lost this year, this is going to be a different looking Maple Leafs team. You look at some of the guys they lost. Jared McCann. Now, he didn't ever play a game in Toronto, but they lost him and Philip Hallander. That was just a misread by Kyle Dubas on maybe who the Kraken were looking to take, which it looked like it was going to be Kerfoot. Until, of course, they bring in Jared McCann. So they lost both McCann and Hallander. So Hallander, which is the guy they traded for Jared McCann. Yes, the guy they traded for Jared McCann. They lost him. But they also lost Jared McCann, who they traded for, to the expansion Seattle Kraken. Just like I said, a misread by Kyle Dubas, a misfire. So you lost both those guys. Zach Bogosian also out. And before I go any further, they did lose a big forward to this group, and that is Zach Hyman. Zach Hyman no longer there, and we know how big of a loss he is to the Toronto Maple Leafs. He's one of those guys that was in the top six. He was in the bottom six. He could play throughout all of your lineup, and now he's a member of the Oilers, so a pretty big loss there. And they obviously lost some goaltending as they move on from Freddie Anderson, who now goes to the Carolina Hurricanes, and let's get into his replacement. So we're going to look at some of the additions to the Maple Leafs, which is a longer list. You have Nick Ritchie and Andre Kasha, both coming from the Boston Bruins, who the Boston Bruins got from the Anaheim Ducks. So interesting to see how that worked out with Ritchie and Kasha, who both did not receive qualifying offers from the Boston Bruins this summer. David Kampf and Michael Bunting come in from the West Coast. David Kampf also did not receive a qualifying offer from the Blackhawks. A lot of people that turned some heads around the league with David Kampf, a good bottom six penalty killing forward. And Michael Bunting, who in Arizona has some potential, and a local kid from Arizona isn't able to stay in Arizona, and maybe he's seeing the writing on the wall with the whole situation around the Coyotes. Maybe that's why he didn't stay. But Michael Bunting now in Toronto, and he's going to get an opportunity to play in the top six, and we'll get into that. Now, looking at some of the other guys they added, they also added Josh Hosang on a player tryout. He was a former first-round pick of the New York Islanders, just never able to get things done. Had some missteps with the Islanders in the AHL with head coach Brent Thompson calling him out. Some bad interviews and just some things that, there were some arguments about bad attitude with Josh Hosang, and we've seen that around the league with certain guys, and he just was never able to shake that. His defensive lapses and stuff like that, it became especially with the Islanders' new culture of defensive first mindset, Hosang was just never going to get there. And then you have Curtis Gabriel, who comes in. He's been bouncing around the league a lot recently. He was in San Jose, then he was in New Jersey, then he was in Philly. He's been all over the place. So hopefully he gets a fit here in Toronto as a guy that's been bouncing around, maybe has some more motivation to maybe try and lock down a spot and find a long-term home somewhere, potentially here in Toronto. And again, adding some grit to that lineup, I do like that add. I didn't mention this on the list, but I also add Brennan Mannell, who they acquired from a 6th or 7th round pick from Minnesota. He's going to add some depth, probably in the AHL, but don't be surprised if he's a call-up and a waiver guy throughout the regular season. That may be a guy in Brennan Mannell for Toronto. They also bring in Peter Marazzi to play alongside Jack Campbell as the two starting goaltenders. Well, the 1A, 1B in Toronto with Jack Campbell. So Peter Marazzi, who has had some injury issues, there is some concern that Marazzi, maybe they're taking a chance on Marazzi. And again, on a one-year deal, that's fine. The only problem is the Leafs have a lot of high expectations that they can go on a run and win a Stanley Cup. They haven't been able to win a round, though, and that's been part of the problem. There's a lot of urgency right now, and what was it, Overdrive up in Toronto said this is, the Maple Leafs' last dance, and then people were tweeting, well, did I miss something? Where were the first 5 championships for the last dance part, right? So, whatever, I think they're just throwing shots at the Leafs, which I hate to say it isn't that hard to do. A team that has just been one of the most unsuccessful franchises in really the last, 3 or 4 decades. It's very frustrating for those fans up in Toronto. They just want to taste a little bit of success, and they've just been deprived of that, and they've tried different things. They've gotten big and tried getting guys in free agency and just keep spending big money. That didn't work. They've also tried to rebuild and build around Austin Matthews, William Nylander, Marner, bringing in John Tavares, and they still can't get it done. They've added grit. They added better defensemen last year, and it just hasn't worked. So is this finally the year where they say enough is enough? Some of their young guys are becoming more mature, getting older. Is this the opportunity for some of those guys? And once we look at the lineup, you're going to see more accountability probably and responsibility for that matter, from some of the higher-end players in Toronto. So the first line, you've got Nick Ritchie, Austin Matthews, and Mitch Marner. I don't see that being the first line going into the season. Now, there is a chance Nick Ritchie jumps into that lineup at some point on the first line, maybe in the top 6. But I would rather see Ilya Mikheyev or Michael Bunting on that top line. And they have them listed as the third line guys, but I think there's an easy mark that they could be on that top line over Nick Ritchie. And that's more of a thing. We'll see what happens in training camp for that. But I think Mikheyev at points worked there last season, as well as Michael Bunting, who could be a nice fresh face in that top 6. So you've got Matthews and Marner and potentially Mikheyev or Michael Bunting on that left side. Second line, you got Alex Kerfoot, John Tavares, and William Nylander. I don't think that's going to change all that much. Maybe Andre Kasha gets a shot on that second line at some point, and Kerfoot becomes the third line center. But I think that's a big reason they brought in David Kampf, is to take that role as the third line center. So we'll see where they put David Kampf. That's really going to determine what happens with Kerfoot and what happens with that left wing on the second line. Third line, they have Michael Bunting, Kampf, and Mikheyev. I don't really see that happening, but okay. Thank you, David. Daily Faceoff. That's what they have. Now the fourth line, I kind of agree with. You got Simmons, Spezza, and Andre Kasha, and I think that's a pretty good fourth line overall. It's not the best by any means, but it's not necessarily bad either. You look at some of their depth guys too. Rodin Amirov, Dennis Malgin, Brett Cini, Mikey Amadio, Joey Anderson, Nick Robertson, Mikhail Abramov, Kirill Semyonov, Pontus Olmberg. These are guys we could see jump into the lineup, and I think the Leafs actually have one of the deeper groups in that regard. I like a lot of those names. I like Brett Cini. He struggled a little bit in New Jersey, just wasn't able to get that crack. He may get that now. You've also got Curtis Gabriel, who they didn't even mention here in the lineup. So there are some guys, Michael Amadio, who was with the LA Kings for a while. I think he's another guy that he never developed into what they want him to be. But for cheap contracts, guys that have potential, I like what Kyle Dubas did this summer. And I've been a pretty big critic of Kyle Dubas, but I do like some of the things he did this year. And then looking at the defense, Morgan Riley and TJ Brody, that worked pretty well last year. TJ Brody obviously came out of the gate very slow, and the League fans definitely let him hear that. The second line, you got Jake Muzzin and Justin Hall as your second pairing. And the third pairing, we're going to finally see Rasmus Sandian get into the lineup, potentially as a full-time top 6 defenseman in the NHL with the Leafs. So Rasmus Sandian and Travis Dermot, who Dermot comes in, and that's a guy they just want to see more of. And he's on a bridge deal, so it's kind of a prove-it-to-us contract. He's got a 2-year deal. They'll see what he does, and from that point, maybe they'll decipher whether he's a third-pairing defenseman or if he has the potential to maybe jump up, take Justin Hall's spot as a top 4 right shot defenseman. But as of right now, they have him as a third pair guy with Sandian. And then goaltending, you got Jack Campbell and Peter Marazzi. There is some injury stuff with this goaltending tandem, which is a concern for the Maple Leafs. But that's why they have 2 of them, right? There is a chance where both of them get injured at the same time. That could happen, but more than likely, you'll have one of the other goaltenders. And Anderson was getting beat up last year in Toronto, really the last 2 years. and I think it was a time for change. Is Marazzi a downgrade? You could make that argument, but the Leafs, I think, depth-wise as a team, that was the sacrifice. It's either you keep Freddie Anderson, who hasn't been working with you, and things haven't been working, and you lose that depth, potentially, or do you sign Anderson, the guy that hasn't been working, hasn't been able to get you over the hump, and you don't get those guys. So I think it was the risk that Kyle Dubas was willing to make, and he did make, and I think he's doubled down on that. And this is really, I think, the Leafs' last shot. Maybe they have another shot after this one. Maybe next year. But again, once Marner and Matthews have to get their re-ups, I don't think they're going to be easy with negotiations in Toronto. And especially with how Kyle Dubas has been pushed around, you could argue, I think there is going to be some concerns about keeping some of the core in Toronto. With that said, let's look at some of their depth guys on defense. Timothy Liljegren, a former 15th overall pick. So they're hoping for him to develop at some point, right? Mac Hollowell, Alex Biega, Carl Dahlstrom, Brennan Mannell, we mentioned him. Joseph Duzak. Those are guys that we're going to see probably play in the AHL for the most part. But again, they could get called up during the season. Just like the Tampa Bay Lightning, I just made a video on them. They are very similar in terms of their salary cap. You could see through it. They have none. So no cap space for the Maple Leafs this year. And that's pretty much the story. They have their first and second round picks for the next 3 years. So they do have some draft capital to use. But they have to go all in this year. And I think Kyle Dubas and Sheldon Keefe realize that their jobs are probably on the line if they don't, at the very least, get past the first round in the 2022 Stanley Cup playoffs. With that said, do the Maple Leafs make the playoffs? And there is some hesitation there because you look at that division. The Tampa Bay Lightning, I think they're the only team that's a real lock. The Florida Panthers, you could argue, are also a potential lock in that category. And then you have Boston, Montreal, and Toronto. I think those three teams will be the teams vying for that final spot. Buffalo is going to be awful, we know that. And Ottawa is continuing to develop, and Detroit, but I don't think they're going to be there. So it's going to come down to, probably at the end of the day, one of two things. Whether who can beat Tampa and Florida more, who can beat the Florida teams more than the other two teams, or who can just get their way through the teams like Ottawa and Detroit and find a way to win those games. It's going to be one of those, potentially both. Who can be better at that between Montreal, Boston, and Toronto? And there is a chance they could sneak into the wild card. But remember, you're not looking at an easy division in the Metro, because once you start looking at the Metro in terms of not getting one of those top three spots, things get very, very heavy in the Metro. I mean, I could rattle off names in the Metro to scare you a little bit. The Islanders, the Rangers, probably not the Devils, the Flyers, the Penguins, the Capitals, maybe not the Blue Jackets, the Carolina Hurricanes. That's 6 teams right there that could get in if you're talking about wild cards. And those are teams that you could probably argue one of those 6 teams at best. Only one of those teams will be unhappy in the Metro, and that's giving no spots to the Atlantic Division in that wild card scenario. So, do the Leafs get into the playoffs? I think they can be that third team to get into the playoffs. But I do have some hesitations with some of this team in terms of goaltending, and that is always going to be there. You just need guys at the right time, in the right place, and the Leafs can go on a run. But as of right now, under Sheldon Keefe and Kyle Dubas, I think they get in, but I don't know how much success they have in the playoffs, because there is, as hard as it will be for the Leafs just to get into the playoffs, is going to be very difficult for them in those said playoffs when you have to potentially play Tampa Bay or Florida in that first round. That doesn't sound good from a Leafs perspective. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. What do you think of the Toronto Maple Leafs? Do they get into the playoffs in 2022? And if they do get in the playoffs, how far do they go? Do they finally win a Stanley Cup and set up the parade in Toronto? Let me know your thoughts down below. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys next time.